Hello, and welcome to the online Congress, Peace in the Light. I am so glad that you are back again, and I am even more pleased to introduce Dr. Walter von Laak to you today. Hello.
Hello, and good day.
Dr. von Laak is a doctor, specialist, author, and university lecturer. And you have written many, many books on the subject of death and near-death experiences. That's how they became very well known. And so, especially if you do some research in the internet for books on the subject, your name comes up again and again. And it has become particularly interesting for my Congress, because this area is still completely hidden for many people. Many people are certainly asking themselves, what is this anyway? And I would now like to take a little look back into the past to see how you became aware of this topic and why you have dealt with it so intensively.
Yes, Mrs. Klug, you see, I am actually a medical doctor and have been working in a field for almost 43 years in the meantime, which has nothing to do with this matter in principle. I am an orthopedist and orthopedic surgeon and have performed many, many, many operations on very many people over the years and have done other things in the field of medicine. And I am also, as you said, professor at the University of Applied Sciences in Aachen, Jülich campus for medical technology, and have been teaching engineers there for many, many years, not physicians at all. So, you see, and that has nothing to do with near-death experiences. And there are a few points that brought me to this. For one thing, I had already started relatively early, I have to say. That means already during my early youth or late childhood, I already had some experiences, extraordinary experiences of consciousness, one would say today, or experiences that actually I tended to repress or ignore, or at least disregarded. Although I didn't forget them, I kept them. And then something happened in 1977, when I was, of course, in the middle of my studies, soon at the end of the medical studies. Then I had the experience that I wasn't given very much time to live anymore. In other words, I was diagnosed with a disease that was obviously not good and certainly not curable. And that meant that I first of all had to completely rely on my own. I didn't do a lot of things that people wanted me to do and said, if there's not much of a chance anyway. This is not a blueprint for others, please. But if there's not much of a chance, that's what I said to myself, then you'll live as long as the oven smokes. How? That was my word. And what I have done as well, I have not only lived well at that time in the 70s, but I also dealt with the subject of death. And since I was very involved in the natural sciences, even at that time and even before that at school, I asked myself the question, is there maybe something after life? And if the natural sciences are right, and this is still true today, the way they try to sell their knowledge, or so-called knowledge to the people, then that is complete nonsense. Then there can be no thereafter, then death is our definitive end. And that's why I've been studying the natural sciences all around, with biology, chemistry, and above all with physics and astronomy, and have realized relatively quickly that there were many gaps. Gaps because they would propagate things quite imprecisely, but what was much worse. Two things. Firstly, when a new phenomenon became known, a new observation became known, it was immediately interpreted, and of course interpreted, on the basis of the spirit of that age. And the second point is that one never looked from one area to the other. That means thinking outside the box did not actually take place. And then I very quickly realized that what the sciences present to us, if you look the box, and if you eliminate the power of interpretation and concentrate on the actual observations, phenomena, measurements, and so on, that then you can come to completely different conclusions that also harmonize with each other, even stringently, that is, coherently harmonize with each other. And there was not even a near-death experience involved. That only came later. But I did learn through the natural sciences back then. That is in the 80s, at the latest, at the beginning of the 90s. Years at the latest. For me, only death cannot be our end. And what the natural sciences tell us cannot be true in that way. And then came the subject of near-death experiences again, among other things by the fact that I had experiences that affected me. And then I got that far that I said to myself, at some point you have to write it down. And then something happened, which certainly wasn't nice. In 1996, already early 1996 on Valentine's Day, my father died. Suddenly, I'd say relatively quickly and unexpectedly, and that led me to say to myself, nope, now the time is running. Now you have to make sure that you preserve what you've learned and what you have gathered from your knowledge, that you also write it down. And that led to the fact that in 1997, I already started with the first book, which I then published in 1999. And that's when it all started, which is almost 25 years soon, next year 25 years, that I have now published many books that all deal with the subject of death as a central theme, but observed complementary from two sides, namely from the more, I would say, religious, philosophical, esoteric side, and the near-death experience, and on the other side, from the natural sciences, but with the same result. And the result is definitive for me today, and I leave it at that. There is no doubt in my mind. Our death is not the end. It goes on for us, for the person affected, without any break. From now on, death is nothing other than for us, or comparable for us, as with other living beings, a metamorphosis. And the classical example, which everyone knows, is the metamorphosis of a caterpillar into a butterfly, into a completely new dimension. And that's how it is for us too.
Such a beautiful picture. Thank you very much. So I really find it very exciting that once again, such a painful moment, like this illness that you had as a young person, took you in a different direction, so to speak, brought.
Besides this thing, I also had a few other events. For example, I was once a hostage at a bank robbery and had a pistol pointed to my head for a certain time, and I once had a heavy car accident and found myself spun over and had still got out of it in one piece. Definitely more occasions than that, and they were in between. So between the mid-70s years and the mid-90s.
Insane. Yes. Yes, looking back. So you did back then, when you had this experience, already thought about it like that? Or did it then gradually come together like a jigsaw puzzle?
So I had already, because of let's put it this way, I kept reminding myself that I had experienced things that I couldn't categorize, where I could say either you suppress them, you ignore them, or regard them as complete nonsense. But I was too self-confident for that. So I told myself it couldn't be like that, accept it at least as a possible reality. And that has always led me to deal with it, and that was somewhere along the line, I'll say a certain common thread to continue dealing with it, because I said to myself, then something else must be wrong. You couldn't have been that stupid, or to have been taken for a ride, I say, and that's how it was. That's how it turned out for me, that I then stayed on the ball. And then I made that happen, to explain that afterwards, above all on a scientific basis. And the near-death experiences are the icing on the cake, so to speak, because the near-death experiences naturally give me quite a lot. Apart from the fact that I had something like that myself, they bring me a whole lot. It's not that I learned about the near-death experience by reading some other books. No, I quickly had the reputation afterwards that I have an ear for it, and that I am also willing to listen, that I'm not one of them, who immediately say that you can only be crazy, which was common at that time, and still is to some extent today. And that's why a lot of people already in, I'll say, the 90s, when I was working as a medical doctor, I was also working down to earth, came to me, and in the 90s anyway, and they opened up to me and told me their stories. And I have always attached great importance to not just communicating verbally, but to documenting everything in writing, if possible, in as much detail as possible. And that was fascinating and fantastic too. And the most interesting thing is that all these people who have had such experiences always, absolutely, and in my cases without any exception, were of the opinion that what they experienced was totally real. And even if it had been 20, 30, or many more years ago, they could on detail recount everything what happened. And that, of course, led to some, let's say, basic principles, and they have always given me a confirmation when I had a question somewhere in the scientific discussion. What could that be the case then? The near-death experiences help. They did not give me the knowledge, but they gave me an additional impulse to follow this red thread that I actually had to follow, and then to bring this together in my eyes to a conclusive view of reality or conception of reality. And that results in our life is not our end here.
There are some scientists who claim that the near-death experience is not an experience, but is comparable, so to speak, to a dream, or where there are, so to speak, disturbances in the brain, some kind of failure. Why do you rule that out?
There are, let's say, 3 points that are usually basically mentioned. One is the lack of oxygen, which was originally responsible for that. The other would be physiological phenomena that take place in the eye, for example, which would then lead to experiences of light and darkness. The third is hallucinations. But hallucinations are completely unreal observations. So if you, for example, you see a cow blasting out of the water next to a dolphin, then that's a hallucination. But a hallucination presupposes that your sensory organs and also your brain are still quite intact. And that is exactly what you actually do not find here. You find people, too, who are blind, for example, or people who are deaf, for example, but who experience completely real near-death experiences. And they find people with disorders, let's say in the brain, or rather with brain failure, for example, with flat lines in the EEG, that is in the electroencephalography, for example, during operations, but also in other situations where these people, despite the loss of this organ, the brain, have a completely intact, comparable, realistic, near-death experience. And that already speaks against it being such physiological causes. As far as the oxygen is concerned, it has to be said that during operations, for example, they get so much oxygen as they would otherwise never rarely get in their lives. And yet, these people have near-death experiences that are just like others, even though they do not have any lack of oxygen. And with medication is the same. There are drugs that act naturally in the brain. You know that, for example, opiates or other substances and hallucinogens. And these substances always have the effect that parts of the brain no longer function properly in the end, and that they do not keep any sense of reality, even when they are come out of this situation, for example, compared with intoxicants. And you do not have that with near-death experiences. And the near-death experiences have even more. The near-death experiences have also still have components that you cannot explain at all with other things. For example, when they only meet again deceased persons, but not persons who are still alive in their experience, or when they see their life rush by, but not only passively, but also as active observers. This means they also experience how others have felt in moments when they may have acted badly or wrongly. That usually does not usually happen. And when they come out of the near-death experience, and that doesn't happen to them in any dream, then they know in the near-death experience, even after 30 years what happened, or after 50 years precisely. In a dream, you don't know that. There are exceptions where this happens, because you may have dreamed something terrible, and say, I can remember there was something, but with the near-death experience, you know everything in detail. And something else, through the near-death experience you lose, if you had a real one, the fear of their death, and often you change your life because you have experienced it is worth changing your life, because otherwise it will somehow and at some point fall back on you. So there are many aspects that speak against the dream and against physiological influences. That doesn't mean that they don't play a role at all. But if so, they only play a role up to a certain level, and beyond this level, something else takes effect, and that is the difference.
Yes, so beautiful. Thank you very much for this really good overview of these differences too again. And I personally think that's significant enough. Even if I haven't had a near-death experience myself, I've had other experiences where I can clearly say that once you've experienced it, then you believe in it, that there is more. And we were both talking about it prior to our interview, that there are also passages in the Bible that do not necessarily talk about an end, an absolute end. I always find that very interesting, because I have also asked myself, we live in a society that is actually of a Christian nature, but why is it that people don't believe in life after death? Or if at all, then only when they really face death themselves, and then, so to speak, out of despair, because there is no hope for them.
Yes, unfortunately. However, they still do not do it, for then there would still be at least a chance. They would be better off believing in it beforehand, so they might not do many things in the first place. Incidentally, a very important point for me today, which is why I do have a certain sense of mission, because I'm of the opinion that many things on this earth are going very wrong at the moment, and is partly deliberately and not to the benefit of the people, of the majority of people. And precisely all these people, that means us as well as them. I'm saying this in general terms without going into detail. Just like them, we actually only have a very, very short lifespan ahead of us. I'm sorry, when I say it like that, it applies to all of us. Whether that's 10 years or 40 years or 50 years is completely irrelevant. No big difference. Not in cosmic terms anyway, but it doesn't have much relevance otherwise either. That means we should actually always be aware of this to think about what happens after we die. And most people today, and you are completely right with your statement, think that death is our definitive end. They also think that the natural sciences would do anything to convey this convincingly, are therefore also of the opinion that it is important for them to find a solution within the remaining time to make the most out of this life for themselves and at best for their loved ones. And then today, there are a few particularly smart people who, in my eyes, are far behind in terms of intelligence, who are actually of the opinion Artificial intelligence would enable them to upload their entire personality, I'll say it now, into a robot or an artificial part, and thus be able to create eternal life mechanistically or naturalistically on this earth. Then it makes a lot of sense, of course, if there are only a few left who do this and the rest works for them. That's an absolute dull, stupid, not only naive, but also an infantile way of thinking that has taken over a lot of space today. And there are some people who are actually convinced of this. I can't understand that. These folks really should lighten up a bit mentally. And that brings us to the real issue, which is this, which is also written in the Bible. You need to come to the realization. You see, when I say in the New Testament, it says Jesus was hanging on the cross, and he said to the butcher next door, "This very day you will be with me in paradise." And that is already the classic example of this, that it was pointed out here that what is about to happen. Our death is nothing else than what I have just said, the metamorphosis into the other. And there are many examples of this in the Bible that repeatedly point that out. And so it is, for example, in the first letter to the Corinthians. I have to read this out because it makes no sense. So then, the question is, and there are heavenly bodies and earthly bodies, but different is the splendor of the heavenly, different that of the earthly bodies. So is the resurrection of the dead. It is sown in transience, that is our earthly life. It is awakened in imperishability. Of course, many people say sometime on some judgment day, but that's nonsense to put it that way, because it means something completely different. And a very important point is again in the second letter to the Corinthians by the Apostle Paul. There, a near-death experience is actually coming to light. Paul writes, "I know a person in Christ who died 14 years ago, and there are already two typical moments that speak out for a near-death experience." Firstly, he talks about another person, not about himself, in the third person, because he is not talking about himself, as anyone who would talk about having had the experience would say, "Are you crazy? You belong?" Today we would say in the nut house. Back then there was certainly something else. The one 14 years ago, that is a long time ago. So it took him a long time to get this far, to talk about it. And now comes the crucial point. He says, "Whether in the body I don't know, or outside the body I do not know, God knows, until the was brought up to the third heaven." And I know that the person in question, third person, and now comes again, "Whether in the body I do not know, or outside the body I do not know, God knows, was brought into paradise, and heard unspeakable words, which to utter them is forbidden to a human being." Something is repeated here, and if in such a letter, in such a context, something is repeated, then that shows the irritation that is involved. And secondly, this extraordinary situation in the first place. And that's exactly what it obviously was. And it shows something else, and that is what the near-death experiences bring us today. This man, at that time, Apostle Paul, who obviously had this near-death experience after a fight that led to a craniocerebral trauma that is historically relatively vouched for, he realized that in this situation, this near-death experience, he not only perceived everything for real, but he also perceived himself as the person in a completely real way. But at the same time realized that this could not actually be true, because the person which he was lay somewhere down on the battlefield. And that's exactly what's happening today with the near-death experiencing people. These people see themselves perhaps at the scene of an accident or on an operating table. They recognize themselves, but they say, "That's not me, not me at all. I'm here, somewhere in the room, and they see me." You see this irritation, and the esoteric, I have to say, I'm not always completely on their side, sometimes even not at all. But I think the esoteric has a beautiful expression. He says subtle, and this subtlety is expressed there. These people are obviously real. When they change here into another dimensionality, undergo a metamorphosis, they are just as intact as they were before, perhaps even more intact. And we find this already in the Bible. And there we also find these clear indications that things continue death. And I mean, the whole Bible is built ultimately on that. You see, Christianity is based on the conviction of the resurrection. However you put that into words, let's put that aside, but the survival of death. And if resurrection, which is celebrated at Easter in Christianity, if you take that away, then you could throw Christianity in the garbage can. Because what is the point of believing in any God or anything else if your life ends in death, and you are here for maybe 60, 70, or maybe even only 20 years of life, and perhaps under undignified conditions, for example, because of guys like that who think they could save themselves to a hard disk. What's this nonsense for then? So that means you need, that is actually the core of all religions in the end, and the core of Christianity. And if you take that away, then religion is useless and it is pointless. And that is exactly what is obviously not the case. And you'll find that again everywhere. Of course, then embellished in some stories, but they don't matter. It's about the principle.
Yes, that's interesting, because the word that just occurred to me, the word religion, that also comes from the Latin religio.
Yes, that actually means to lead back. So that's right, that's how I see it too. And we know today that humans have certainly existed much, much longer than we have been told in the teachings of paleontology. We have only found humans a few years ago, for example, the so-called Naledi people in the South African region, who lived 300,000 years ago and who already had very, let's say, advanced burial rites. So they already back then had put things in the grave of their departed that they would need in a new world, I say. And you see, that's where we come to the core, and with the word religion you are, of course, exactly right. There are, I think, 3 core points, and the one core point is that there is an entity that is superior to us, which in Christianity we call God. The fact is, you also have to say the word God does not really hit the spot entirely, because in the Old Testament, in the first book, Genesis 1, there is actually the term Elohim, and Elohim was then translated as God, but El is actually God, and Elohim is actually the deity or the creative power. You can still say the gods. Therefore, the term Elohim as a plural is just as correct as a singularization, but then under a different cloak. I have this in my books, then mathematized it, and that describes that issue very well, but I don't want to go into that here. So it's obviously something that goes beyond that, and we cannot describe it at all, no matter how, whether we describe it in the Hindu, Buddhist, or Christian, or in the Islamic world. We cannot describe it. It is obviously an entity superior to us, without us being able to describe it, but it is real. So the second is, there is a kind of spiritual world, but we belong to it, and we realize that yes, when we talk to each other, then this is possible because of 2 things. First is that we now have developed brains that we can utilize for conversations even abstractly, not perhaps like animals that can also exchange certain things, which also need intelligence, but we can also do it abstractly, and not only that, we live. And life is obviously a force that comes from continuity because we are going through a time here. Let's stay with the here and now, a time that runs continuously. But continuity is not a physical concept. It doesn't exist in physics. Physics lives from discontinuity or the quantization. In physics, we only create a continuity by introducing an artifice. But I don't want to go into that now, only the trick is then called in light, in the smallest particles, the photons. They are just wave and particle in one. But we'll talk about that another time perhaps, or you read my books. It's there in detail broken down in it, how you should actually understand this. So the continuity is first transported into it, but our life is continuous, and definitely so. That is, our life indicates that there must be this other dimensionality reality, and if we talk about it abstractly, then that is another very compelling indication. So, and the third point is, we simply survive our death. That means that death is not our end, and that also makes a lot of sense. It already makes sense just by the prior statements alone. Because if physics is the world of the discontinuous, of the quantized, then we also know from physics, and a director of a Max Planck Institute in Munich, Garching, once said very nicely, a professor, Dr. Hasinger, he once said that in an interview about 15 years ago, there's a paradox or a phenomenon because physics is actually shows us that everything tends towards more disorder. We know that. It's called entropy. We know that every star that grows reaches its zenith, and at some point it dies again, and then it disintegrates just like a human being when he dies. It disintegrates into its atoms or into its molecules and atoms, and that is entropy. The disorder increases in this world. But that's what Hasinger says back then very nicely. We have something inexplicable that is a paradox on the other side. We have an increasingly order of the information of the spiritual, and that is exactly what we also have. You see, when you are born, or each of us is born, then grows consistently and not just linearly, but even progressively with increasing age. The mental ability, the mental capacity increases, and we reach this zenith of our mental capacity, that is the informational capacity at the time of our death. Let's leave out dementia or Alzheimer's or something like that. These are physical illnesses, not mental illnesses. In other words, the informational increases over the course of our lives. It grows up. It becomes more and more complex, and when we die, therefore alone, logic tells us someday in time, this physical coat will deteriorate. But what has grown up in the meantime, this spiritual, this informational part, in what way should that die or be destroyed? No, it prevails in that complexity. Your personality as it is, of course, passes over during that metamorphosis that we call death into another dimension, in which you recognize yourself with integrity just as you do now, although you are no longer in the here and now. And that is exactly the point where you have to say the third point is the decisive one for us. And if it didn't exist, and didn't exist already existed 300,000 years ago, or probably many more years ago, then everything that has developed from it, namely not only funeral rites, but entire religious movements, directions and aspirations, or even religion, would completely superfluous. That's already been there. That's the conviction. That is one of the realizations of man, and that's actually how becoming human is characterized. Man did not become man because he climbed down from the tree and because he has developed a hand or lives on two legs. No, because his central nervous system, as a central constant of physical development, was so far developed that it had a level at which it was just more expressive than on a lower level. And this expressiveness doesn't just mean not only to transmit downwards, but it also means receiving from above, in quotation marks from above. We have a device which we call the central nervous system, which enables us to now work on this level to do more than perhaps a monkey before us or a pigeon so and so many millions of years ago, because the central nervous system as this central constant has evolved significantly. But this central constant is the central nervous system. That is not what the mind or the information, the complex information produced or spit out, so to speak, as EPI phenomenon like some philosophers claim. No, it is the mediator, it is the device or the apparatus or the equipment, you can name it as you like, which is there to take information that exists in this world and exists constantly and implement it or communicate with it and to absorb them again. And we, as a personality, are such a complex information cluster that has developed over the course of our lives. And when we die here, we die because we simply have to, because the physical cannot go on. At some point, the end has come. That's the way it has to be. The equipment breaks down. That's what happens to your car at some point. Or your coat, which you then throw in the bin somewhere or pass it on. It doesn't go on forever, but the information that was in the car, or in the coat, or in our body, that is of course at its zenith for the time being. And then it goes on from there. It continues. And that is what we then superficially call our death. But if people had the thought to understand that, that's the crucial thing. And above all these bums in this world who think they're doing nonsense today at the expense of others. In the meantime, there are too many of them, and with too much influence. Then it would be better, because there is a problem at the latest, when they realize, in quotation marks, they are dead, which means they are still alive. They realize that actually not at all. That comes again from the near-death experiences. A lot of people say, I didn't realize that I was supposed to be dead. That's what they say afterwards. I only realized that when I met my grandmother. Just to give you an example. When these people have this experience, and everyone will, then it's just too late for these people if they stay over there. Because they experience, and that's what they have to learn, they then learn that they are responsible for everything, but really for everything that they ever have done and will ever do. They are solely responsible. Only they themselves. Only each for himself. Each alone has to find a way out of this shit. Sorry. The mess that he may have made. And I can tell you how that will work. It will work by recognizing that the most important thing as prerequisite is that he regrets each deed, that he is prepared for each in individual cases, mind you, in individual cases apologizes, and this is the worst and most difficult, and we are told this repeatedly from near-death experiences, from some other extraordinary levels of consciousness that you will afterwards have to, and that will be the biggest problem, visit every individual who has been damaged in the course of time, that is in a different dimensionality, much, I'll say technically simpler because it's a different dimensionality you can't compare here with here. Visit every single one, and this brings us back to the Bible, ask for forgiveness. And that is again as a beautiful parable in the Bible, where people say today, what nonsense. It says that if someone strikes me on the right cheek, turn to him your left. Anyone who reads that says, that's bullshit, nonsense. I'm not crazy. When slapped on the right cheek, why should he also hit my left as well? But that's not what we mean. In the past, when someone wanted to humiliate another one, let's say with the old Jews, ancient Israelites, if someone wanted to humiliate someone, then he would beat him. Most of them were still right-handed back then, just as we are today. Then he would hit him to the right cheek with the back of his right hand. And when he then recognized and repented, recognized that he had made a mistake, and repented and apologized for it, then he had to then touch him with his right palm on his left cheek with the palm of his right hand. And he had to, the injured party's counterpart, also had to turn his left cheek. Only if that happens, then both are relieved. The one who has been injured is relieved because he dropped a stone and he can continue to grow. That's the decisive factor, the growth, but the spiritual and emotional growth. And the person who made the mess, who did the damage, is relieved because he has finally found the person in question and did everything he had to do, repent, apologize, and ask for forgiveness and receive forgiveness. That is also already in the Bible, and that is precisely the point. And everyone will get there. And it is still in the Bible. And I think that's so great. Jesus then suddenly said, "Turn back." Yes, what is meant by that? It is meant to recognize. There are two things that are prerequisite for our actions today, and here must be recognized as maxims. The one is love your neighbor as yourself and yourself both, and the other is then expressed in the so-called categorical imperative of Immanuel Kant, where it is wonderfully illustrated. When it says, quite broken down, what you don't want people to do to you, do not do to anyone else. These are the two maxims. And then it says, turn back in the life we have here to act precisely according to these principles. Love your neighbor as yourself, and what you do not want done to you, that do not do to others. That is exactly the point. And if these people who are very unpleasant today and think they have to rule this world and seek eternal life on some hard disk in a robot or artificial intelligence, try to seek that in the course of life at the expense of others, of course these people will all perish. All without exception. I wouldn't care at all whether they did or didn't. Man forges his own destiny, so to speak, responsible only for themselves. But when these people dig at the roots of humanity again today, as has obviously already been the case in the Bible several times, and humanity is in danger of falling to a large percentage, to fall back, as it says in the Bible, into pre-civilization, to the Adama, as it is called there, and is always translated incorrectly, namely with soil or earth, which actually means arrest, in Hebrew, and not Adama, then develop a certain sense of mission and tell the people, pay attention, you still have the chance to repent today because you only have a short life expectancy, whether 10 or 40 years. And after that, things will get dicey for you because then you can see how you get on. The greater your guilt here, the longer you have to work. And let me tell you from today's perspective, that can easily mean 1,000 years. Because over there, time is different and no longer plays a role. But it will be very hard for these people. And that's not just said for that reason. I also have indications. I don't want to say evidence now, but evidence like indications that I receive from another level, not only me personally, but above all via other people who have what I call a phase-shifted perception. That's what I call it. That means a direct ability to perceive, which we might call mediumship. And these people explain to me, for example, I know a lady who lives not far from here, namely near Cologne, who works very, very seriously in my eyes, and who will also be speaking at my next conference in November. This lady receives information that is great, that is verifiable, and that show one thing at a time, in any case. People have a different, let me put it bluntly, because we have to speak with our words, and the words are not right, of course. We can't talk in one dimension about another one if we haven't gotten to know it, so we have to speak with our own words. People have a different aura, even after they have left here, and they also live, or they are together with people with similar radiation, or the aura. And this aura, it has to change first to, I'll just say it flatly, and it may all sound stupid, but needs to be at least metaphorically accepted in order to reach other higher spheres or levels. And if you do not change that aura, you will not arrive there, not get there for the time being. You will get there at some point because that is the course of events for everyone. but it can take forever. Forever is not right, but take many, many, many years, perhaps even thousands of years, and that will be very depressing and very, very bad. That's why I can only advise from this perspective that these people actually turn back to face this oppressive, difficult, terrible time, which they will only experience alone, that they will avoid this time in the here and now, and for the benefit others as well. That's the big problem.
So beautiful. Yes, that also emphasizes once again this personal responsibility that every single one of us should take on. And yes, I think many people are not at all aware of this, really aware of it, because they are very much characterized by patterns and imitate things that they have already learned from their ancestors, so to speak, behavioral patterns or attitudes, an inner attitude towards life. And that's where it's really so important, what we have just mentioned, that it can also have an impact on life after death, how we ourselves take responsibility.
Yes, you have to take responsibility here already. If you realize that, then you have all the chances in the world to do something about it. But that's not just educational or pre-generational, so to speak. Inheritance in your personality, but you also develop in this way. You yourself will perhaps know that there are people who recognize an eroticism of power and an eroticism of money once they've smelled it. And there are people who know how to deal with it anyway. There are people who thrive at the expense of others. And in my eyes, both currently, unfortunately, is very much culminating. And that needs to be worked on. And that has to be done now. Otherwise, we have a problem, the problem which we find again and again in the Bible, destruction of a large group of humanity, I say relapse into what the Bible calls Adamah, to the pre-civilization period. The man will evolve again at some point or develop a similar form, but it may take thousands of years, perhaps even longer. But then we have committed a crime against ourselves, and others are doing the same. If they stick with it, and that will fall back on you alone, you are the ones who have to pay for it.
And it is perhaps important to emphasize here once again that this is not a phenomenon that is only documented in the Bible, so to speak, but it is a sociopolitologists, for example, who confirm that societies have always developed in such a way that develop to a certain point of decadence, where they then fall back into so-called barbarism. Unfortunately, that's the great danger.
Yes, there's also a saying, it comes from an old, I'll say, Arab man, a sheik, who's being quoted, my parents, they still rode camels. I, in of my generation, I'd say from a generation almost beyond good and evil, like me. In my generation, we got off the camels and have already learned to build ships, to build houses, and to drive cars. My children's generation, they fly around, they drive great cars. I say Ferraris and Aston Martins or anything else, or Porsches. They can spend money like nothing. Whether they can handle it or not is another question. But they throw it out like nothing. The children's generation of our children, that is the grandchildren's generation, will probably ride camels again.
Yes.
Yes, something like that, that's comparable to what you said. It's exactly the case. And as I said, what you find with some intelligent philosophers or intelligent founders of religions You also find this in various religions in a similar form, as well as in Christianity or otherwise. And the solution for everyone has always been to fall back on the original, and that was this Trinity, divine level. To put it simply, regardless of whether they call it God or Elohim, gods or the power of creation or anything else, it doesn't matter, the divine level, spiritual level to which we belong, that everything belongs to. But we can also think about it and can abstract because we are far enough evolved and survive our death, because death only concerns the physical, and that is the material which physically goes in the direction of entropy, maximum disorder, but the spiritual, the emotional, is connected to it, strives towards maximum order, that the second side, you can already find it in Lao Tzu 2,500 years ago with Yin and Yang, where it is always pointed out everything has two sides, and that's exactly how it is. And this second side is the one to which we belong, the one to which animals also belong, but the difference is that we can think about it. The animals, they live in the being, and we live in the becoming, and our becoming depends on how we think about this becoming and what insights and conclusions we draw from it. Developing insights and drawing conclusions, and some people who may have a lot of money, a lot of power, but they are too stupid to draw conclusions, and that is for them, or would be absolutely helpful and necessary for them to do that. But now, before humanity again strives towards Adama, to bring back the biblical again, you see, it all intertwines, and they find everything somewhere again. And what we think today, what we talk about today, people were already talking about it thousands of years ago, perhaps differently, even differently, of course. And they perhaps also did not have scientific knowledge to underpin the whole thing, but they didn't need the scientific knowledge back then either, because for them, it simply worked intuitively. When you tell someone something like that today, that it goes on after death, he might ask, "Are you actually stupid? How is that supposed to work?" The physicists tell me this, the biologists tell me that, the chemists tell me that, but in the moment when I ask, has the physicist ever checked with the biologists or the chemists what fits together and what can't fit together, then you will get the answer. No, do you have to? So that means that skepticism is growing today because we think we know more, and yet we still don't. This also goes back to the ancient Greek philosophers. The more we know, the less we actually know. But there are red threads, and the red thread that has already been there 100,000 years ago and has led to certain burial rites, and that is the same as we can develop today. And in my books, I mathematize that it has a big advantage, although some people not necessarily understand it straight away, although it is quite simple, elementary mathematical logic, but it actually predicts how something, maybe not in detail, but how something works in principle, and that is crucial. You'll find that in the books.
Yes. So exciting. I would like to talk about one more topic because you've scratched this again and again, but we are not yet really gone into it. Do we still have room to talk about the topic of funeral rites?
Please.
Because I think this is also important for people who are dying right now, for example, and or are accompanying others. It is perhaps also an interesting thing to see whether we can still influence that now.
Yes. Funeral rites or burials are a human, I'll say it now, a human tradition or invention and behavior that has changed completely over the course of time, or has also been changed by religions, changed by whatever. And these burial rites are actually secondary, that is the human side, because the one who has died and who is being buried, however, is no longer there. So now let's get back to us. I take you personally now, you change your car. You may have done that in your life a few times already. Have you ever gone to the junkyard to see what's happened with your car? No. I'm going to assume you didn't sell it to someone. It was actually scrapped. Let's just take that as an option. You didn't, of course not. It doesn't interest you any longer. Let's make it easier. I have just used the term coat. Your coat has holes, is moth-eaten, I say. Your coat is kaput. You can't donate it to charity. You're throwing it away. Are you interested in what happens to the coat then? No. You are no longer in the coat. You're not in the car either. You're not driving with the car. The car is no longer running, and the coat is no longer worn. You are not there. You are not the person who is lying in the cemetery or being cremated. You are not there. There are people who ask me, what do you want? Do you want to be, what do I know, what, buried, or be cremated? I say I'll do neither. They look at me and say, how are you going to be neither? I'm not there then. Seneca, the old Roman philosopher, Seneca, who once said this around 50 AD Christ, once said it quite beautifully. He said, where there is life, there is no death. And where there is death, there is no life. That is where we speak to each other here. There is life. We can exchange ideas there. There is spirit that flows, I say now, through words. But the moment you are dead, life is no longer there. The force that moves you and also enables you to exchange spiritually no longer exists in this body. That's why it doesn't matter at all. And that's why I want to consciously break it down. See, look, a lot of people have died in wars. An uncle of mine died in the Second World War II with my name, Walter van Laak. And what happened to him? Nobody knows. He is somewhere in Russia. He has fallen, as they say so beautifully in German, and what I never understood as a child. I asked my father, why did he fall? He can also get up again. Yes? No. He's somewhere, I'll say buried at best, if buried at all, but maybe not even that. The funeral rites are human inventions, and everyone should do that in the tradition as he wishes. That is all well and good, because it's not about the deceased. The funeral rites are only about the bereaved. The surviving relatives are the ones who have to deal with it and who have to take care of it. And that has to be like that for the bereaved. Of course, if the deceased has said beforehand that he would like to have it this or that way, then it is in my eyes, it is a duty that the survivors make sure that this is the case. But basically, this is an act of the people living here, that is those still living here, no longer of the deceased. The deceased does not care anymore. And since I am convinced of that he is not dead at all, but that it continues to live, only metamorphosed into another dimensionality, to put it in fancy words again, he actually doesn't care at all. Just as you couldn't care less about what happens to your old car or your old coat. Let others talk about that. That's not what the deceased is interested in. Maybe he might be interested. There are people who are in contact with the souls of the dead to a certain degree, by chance, or they even might want to have it. Sometimes that's also obviously possible, that they could be interested in whether their wish, which they, in quotation marks, had during their lifetime, in the here and now, verbally or in writing, that it has also been implemented. That may be. I also don't want to rule out the possibility individual cases, but on the whole, it doesn't matter.
Yes. And how is it then in ancient cultures, advanced civilizations? There were very different rituals.
Yes, because of course the survival of death was always associated with it. It was assumed that one would go into a different dimensionality. But these dimensionalities were, of course, sometimes very earthly or even subterranean nature. For example, the Hades of the ancient Greeks. Yes, of course, it was then adapted to this philosophy in some form or other. People were given something to eat, something to drink, or they were given clothes or given containers, or they were buried in certain pyramids, where they were also buried very high, so that they were closest to the sun god, for example. All these things played a role. Interestingly enough, the decisive central organ for our communication or mental exchange, namely our brain at that time, had not been regarded as crucial, and for example, in the case of the old Egypt, when they died, the first thing they did, they liquefied and removed the brain through the nose. That wasn't important. But you see, these are all, let me put it this way, earthly human things, inventions, philosophical creeds that have nothing to do with the actual reality, which are not worse because of that or anything like that. Everybody should do what they want. But you are not decisive, because you are not there. Where there is death, there is no life.
Yes. And if someone wants to make contact now, for example, so to speak, to exactly this subtle part of us, so I personally also work medially. And for me, for example, it has always been irrelevant to go to cemeteries.
To what?
Cemeteries, for example.
Yes, I do that, by the way, if I may say so, actually quite gladly, because in Cologne, for example, there is one cemetery which is a really great park, and there you have old monuments that are interesting to see. But I'm interested in not about the melting away. Although my parents lie there, for example, the remains there are lying there. I always say it like that deliberately. I say it like that because a dear cousin of mine always says, when you go to the cemetery, then please say hi to our parents as well, because his parents are lying there. Please send my regards. I don't even think about it. You can do that now. But you do not need to do that on the cemetery. They're not there. So that plays a different role, but you're absolutely right. I don't go there either, because I don't associate anything with it in terms of contact opportunities, but only because it is a very nice park, and the cemetery, which I mean, there are even parrots that were released there and that are still flying around. That's the kind of thing. But the monuments are quite interesting, but that's why I don't associate emotions with it.
Yes, perhaps at this point too. Right now for the listeners. For me personally, a place like the cemetery, for example, or wherever else a grave might be, is rather a place that is perhaps particularly suitable for taking the space for mourning and for contact with the other. But you can also do that at home. I think it's just for some people. Some people need this path. So to speak that way, perhaps, to go there.
Perhaps also important in order to deal with the topic at all. Yes, so not even for the contacts, but to deal with it. Yes, and where you say mediumship, that is denied by many, but it is almost certainly a fact, to put it this way, that our brain is not only functions via our sensory organs, but also has a direct receptive capacity with what surrounds us. And that is all available information, and therefore also the deceased, because they live on. But not everyone can do it well. You have to, I'll say it, you can perhaps train a little, but it probably also requires a certain talent, which, however, interestingly enough, grows stronger through some kind of extraordinary consciousness perceptions that you may have had in the course of your life. And that's why I call it also a parallel, shifted ability to perceive. that this must be so. It's not something that's just talked about and pure speculation. This can be demonstrated by a phenomenon which exists in medicine and for which there is no reasonable explanation. Medical, physiological explanation, just as little as for many things in the field of near-death experiences. And then it is always good, as you may know from science, is always good when you find a small group. The smaller the group, the more manageable it is, and the easier it is to find reliable results can be achieved. And this small group that I'm talking about now are the so-called knowledgeable autistic people, insular gifted autistic people to be precise. Autism is something widespread and not necessarily a problem, but among autistic people there is a small group of people who are also moronic, that is, has a very low intelligence quotient and who are not able to live on their own. They need help to do so, for example, tying their shoes or making food or whatever. But in this small group of these moronic autistic people who have incredible abilities, they are also known as savants or even insular people. There are people who can travel across a big city and can fly in a helicopter 3/4 of an hour to memorize this city. And then, after 3 or 4 days, they can draw the entire city with all the details. For example, Rome, with all the columns and windows, and you can recount. That's all accurate. Or there are musically gifted, insular gifted, deeble autistic people like Mr. Paravicini, for example, from England, I believe, who is able to listen to the most difficult pieces of music once and is immediately able to play them on the piano and even in a different key, instantly. Or there are those who, and that's where it was actually discovered by a neurologist who died a few years ago, a neurologist from New York, a neurophysiologist, namely Oliver Sacks, who once wrote a book in the 70s or 80s years ago, but this research dates back to the 60s. The book is called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat. That was, it sounds nice, but this is actually about psychiatric clinical pictures, but there is one case, and it's actually striking. In the 60s, he had a conversation with 2 brothers who were debile autistic, were in their early 20s and who, throwing numbers at each other, numbers. They couldn't count and they didn't know what 1 + 1 or 3 + 5, but they threw at each other long chain numbers, so I know what's 7-digit, for example, or 8-digit numbers, and he didn't know what to do with to start with, and then he wrote them down. Then he went there, as there were no computers and had a big atlas, I say, looked up what that was and realized that they were so-called prime number twins, multi-chain or many-chain prime twins. Prime number twins are relatively common in the low-digit range, but the higher the numbers become, the rarer they become, and it is subsequently easier to get 6 correct numbers in the lottery, I say, than to get a prime number twin in the 11-digit range, and that's exactly what they were able to do. And if he then threw another number that has nothing to do with it, where there is also no twin, there was no prime number twin, then they just laughed and then talked to each other, went on. So how can such people do that? They can obviously only do it because these numbers or these pieces of music or these pictures, even if they are no longer before their eyes see them because they exist in an informational world, and that is only possible if they have a phase-shifted, at least that's what I call it, direct perception via their brain, and that's what they have. And people who become more psychic in the course of their lives, and there are many, I also know a number of people who are developing more and more such a phase-shifted perception, or they have had it from the beginning, because that also exists, and so they can also receive such insights, and this information is sometimes worth its weight in gold. It is used by the not yet believed by the others, but it is true, and you should trust them.
It's amazing what new insights you can gain. So I myself have also met someone before whose sister is autistic and also has such a marginal talent on a mathematical basis. And I was so fascinated because she also was, as they say, moronic. She also cannot write herself, for example. Or so you the first, I think, 7 or 8 years of her life. They didn't even consider that she would be intelligent. And then, using a computerized method, they found out she is highly intelligent, in the sense that she really does seem to have a talent, but which no one can explain. Absolutely, because she doesn't read any math books.
So these attempts at explanation, which of course always come up, of course, interpretations of phenomena. As I said at the beginning, they are of course completely helpless, absolutely helpless, especially if they come from a medical background, are helpless, and where they mention that from the acquaintance, there are cases where post-traumatic, that is after an accident mechanism with craniocerebral trauma, something like this occurs from one moment to the next immediately, and that cannot be explained at all, especially mathematical things. There are people who have nothing to do with math. I'll just say that in one case, definitely been beaten up and were treated with a heavy traumatic brain injury in hospital. So they got out of the hospital, they walked through the forest and can still do that, of course, and can calculate the surface area of each leaf in their heads. They didn't even know what the number pi was beforehand. Times exaggerated. So that's the crucial, that is, they see it. They don't see it with their eyes like we do, but they see it through direct, immediate perception. Our brain is much more than just simply a hard disk, as some people actually believe that they could save themselves too. But they'd be better off to get rid of that bullshit as soon as possible.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor Van Laak. That is really this information. These experiences that you have shared with us are so rich. I believe that one or the other will certainly have the urge to rewatch this video, this interview several times, because it really is a lot, or just get your books right away.
The interviews perhaps stimulate some appetite for them, and they give a different point of view, which I have now testified, because there are also reasons for it in the meantime. I also hold, I will send it to you, seminars. Now this year is another one. It's only every 2 years, that's why I say it. In November, there will be another one where the lady I was just talking about will be speaking, by the way, who has great medial abilities, very serious, good abilities in my eyes, and great things have emerged already from there. So if people are also interested, they should, of course, hurry a bit, because it's not long until November, and also places will then be scarce, but you should register as early as possible, which of course is feasible. I will send it to you. That info,
we'll put a link to it under the video.
You only need to enter the book page or the page www.natoderfahrung.info. You will find all the info, and you can download some things directly, flyers or something like that, now independently of the books.
Yes. Exactly. So all the information can be found under the video. So all viewers and listeners, yes, I would like to thank you again, Professor Van Laak, once again, for all the information and experience that you have shared with us. And of course, I would also like to thank you to all the listeners who have now listened through to the end. Yes, this has been a very long interview, very, very rich. So thank you very much.
Dear Mrs. Klug, I also have to thank you. It was a pleasure to talk to you about these things, and if I can help some people with it, that is a special pleasure, then I have achieved a lot. Thank you too.